And a good day to you, everyone. Russ Barkley here with your Saturday Research Review. It's a lovely fall Saturday here in Richmond. Nice sunny day, and that's why I'm running a little late here. Just thought I'd get out and get some exercise before I do our research review. Here's a couple of dad jokes for you. These can be shared with kids, and they have to do with math. So pay attention. Here we go. Why did the two fours skip lunch? Because they already ate. Get it? Okay. Here's another one. Why should you worry about the math teacher when she's holding graph paper? Because she's definitely plotting something. Yeah, I love that math joke, Jerry. Good math joke. All right, last up. Why did the student wear glasses in math class? To improve division. You almost have to say it as division, don't you? Okay, enough of that. Let's move on to our four articles for this Saturday. The first is a paper published over in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and it is a longitudinal study conducted in the UK following large samples of children through childhood and into adolescence. So they followed them from age 9 months all the way up through age 17 years. And they had over 7,800 children enrolled in this study. They, of course, took the children and classified them as those who eventually went on to have high symptoms of ADHD. That's our ADHD group. And they had a control group. And what they're looking at is the body mass index, the weight of these children across time and how it's related to their ADHD symptoms. What the authors found in the study is that children with ADHD were significantly lighter in their weight at birth than control children. This makes sense because we know that ADHD can be associated with earlier delivery, that is, with prematurity, and we, of course, expect those children to be lighter. But overall, regardless of prematurity, the children were lighter at birth, not a surprising findings. However, what they found is that if they followed them up over time, that those with higher levels of ADHD symptoms were more likely to be obese by age 5 years. They also found that symptoms at ages 7, 11, and 14 were predictive of a much greater body mass index or greater weight at 3 to 5 years later than was seen in the control group. This was a much stronger relationship seen in females with ADHD than with males, but both sexes showed a relationship between early ADHD and later heavier body mass index. So this helps us to understand a little better the relationship that we've already talked about on this channel between ADHD and obesity, that while ADHD children may not start out as obese, over time, probably because of their dietary choices and their less exercise, we find that there is a growing risk for obesity. And in females, we also find a growing risk for binge eating disorders than we do in typical females. Now, the last was not studied in this particular research project, but it has been found in other studies, which is why I mentioned it. So you can have a look at my video on this channel on ADHD and obesity, particularly binge eating, if you have the time. So let's move on to our next study, which is on sex differences and intellectual differences in children who are diagnosed earlier with ADHD versus those who are diagnosed later. This is a study that comes out of Canada. It's also using very large samples of children. In this case, up to 1,380 children were used in this study out of Ontario. And what they're looking at here is the relationship between sex, IQ, and the age at which you got diagnosed as ADHD. And the authors found that children with higher IQs were diagnosed later than children with lower IQs. This makes sense if you think about it. Higher IQ children can get through the earlier grades in school with less impairment than more typical children or children with lower IQ. Those children are likely to come to our attention earlier because they're not doing as well in school as the children with higher intelligence. So that kind of makes sense. But the authors also found that children from higher socioeconomic status were also diagnosed later. Now, you might think that that's counterintuitive because you would expect that these families have more resources and more health care and therefore can get their children diagnosed earlier. But it might be the other way around, that because these families have more resources with which to cope with and assist their children, they may not be referring them quite as early as children whose families have fewer resources and therefore need more assistance in helping with their children. So I thought that was an interesting relationship as well. The study also found that having a mother who was not white, that is a non-white ethnicity, was also related to a later age of diagnosis. I'm not quite sure how to understand that. Perhaps you have some thoughts on that as well. But that's what they found in the study. So again, higher IQ, higher social status, that is socioeconomic status, were related to later diagnosis for ADHD up there in Canada. All right, our next paper comes to us from the journal Psychiatry Research Communications. This is a study that was a collaboration out of Japan and Taiwan, and it's using very large databases to calculate the genetic risk for problems with melatonin secretion and risk for ADHD. So kind of an interesting paper here because remember, we've talked about how ADHD individuals have a much higher rate of sleeping problems than does the general population. This study seems to suggest that one possibility in accounting for those sleeping difficulties is that individuals with ADHD also carry a higher genetic risk for disturbances in melatonin secretion. And as you know, melatonin is related to the onset of sleep as well as other sleep parameters. So a fascinating study here that shows that the more risk genes you have for difficulties with melatonin secretion, the more likely the individual is to have ADHD and to have more severe ADHD symptoms. Fascinating study there. My last research study for this morning is from the journal Frontiers in Public Health, and this is a study on the association between maternal exercise during pregnancy and ADHD risk in the preschool children of those pregnancies. This is a study out of China. And what they found using a fairly substantial sample size of more than 4,100 children is they found that mothers who exercise for less than 20 minutes per day had a higher rate, nearly double the rate of ADHD in their preschool offspring than did mothers who exercise for longer periods of time, 20 to 40 minutes or more than 40 minutes. The authors go on to believe that maternal exercise, therefore, is contributing to risk for ADHD in offspring, and they encourage people to get more exercise when they are pregnant in order to reduce this risk. But wait a second. If you followed my research reviews for the past year, you know that this is a correlation and it can't be interpreted as causation the way the authors want to do. They want you to think that the exercise is predicting the risk for ADHD. However, we know that people with ADHD get less exercise. So it may be that the mothers who did not exercise as much had a higher genetic risk themselves for being ADHD. And of course, maternal ADHD is a strong predictor of ADHD in their offspring. So that's just as likely an explanation for this relationship than the one that the authors wish to infer here. So once again, correlation is not causation. And we need to take into account the genetics of ADHD before we go looking at how these correlations can be interpreted as causing ADHD. All right, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the research review. I sure did. I'm always learning something every week when I review these papers for you. And thanks for tuning in. As always, if you're not a subscriber, think about it. If you are, think about recommending this channel to others with a need for this information. And as always, live well and be well. Take care, everybody. Bye now.